Voice fades in over haunting strings. A distant heartbeat, a creaking wooden floor, a whisper, then silence. History tells us who held the whip, but not who hid their cruelty behind lace gloves. The screen fades to black. Only the echo of slow footsteps remains. Each step heavier than the last, like time itself walking through the halls of a haunted past. We've been told that slavery's cruelty wore the face of the overseer, that its violence spoke in the deep voice of men. But in the hidden corners of those vast plantations, another kind of power moved quietly, softer in sound, but no less brutal in its touch. These are the stories the history books refuse to whisper, the ones too scandalous for polite white society, too painful for the enslaved to speak. They lived in the spaces between the screams, in the long shadows cast by the plantation sun. What happens when power, race, and silence collide in the darkest corners of the plantation? The year is somewhere between 1780 and 1850, the height of the American South's twisted glory. Mansions built on stolen breath. Cotton fields stretching farther than the eye can see. Every petal of magnolia sweetened by the sweat of black bodies. The air hums with contradictions. By day, white women glide through candlelit halls, their dresses brushing against marble floors, their laughter echoing at dinner tables lined with silver. They are the image of gentility, pure, delicate, protected. Society calls them the angels of the house. But beneath the silks and pearls lies something far uglier. Because purity in this world was only a performance, one that thrived on the suffering of others. The very hands that clutched lace fans were also the hands that signed bills of sale. White womanhood was worshipped. Black life was owned. That was the arrangement, cruel, perfect, obscene. And within that arrangement, new kinds of evil were born. Not the open brutality of the whip, but the quieter, colder power of control, of domination disguised as grace, of cruelty performed behind locked doors and drawn curtains. If the plantation was a grand theater, its stage shimmered with civility. But the real show, the horror, played backstage where no one dared to look. Power, after all, does strange things when left unchecked. It twists, it festers, it begins to feed on the very people who believe they control it. In this world, every black man, woman, and child was legally property. They were counted not as human beings, but as assets. Bodies could be bought, sold, punished, or touched without consequence. Control was total. Chains were only one part of it. The rest was fear, silence, the knowledge that even a glance, even a word spoken at the wrong time, could mean death. For the enslaved, survival meant obedience. It meant knowing when to look down, when to vanish, when to smile through pain. And for those who owned them, especially the women left behind in the big houses, that absolute power was intoxicating. Southern morality preached purity, faith, and order. But beneath that mask, a different kind of desire grew. One rooted in frustration, envy, and loneliness. The byproducts of a system that trapped even its masters inside invisible cages. White mistresses lived lives of privilege, yes, but also confinement. Their husbands ruled over fields and fortunes. They ruled over the home, and those forced to labor within it. They were told they were weak. But here, in the private empire of the household, they wielded godlike power over those who had no rights at all. And some used it in ways history dared not repeat. Behind lace curtains, cruelty wore perfume instead of blood. It smiled in the daylight and whispered commands at night. Diaries from the era, fragments of letters, second-hand accounts, they hint at something the public never wanted to admit. That the mistress of the house could be as cold, as vicious, as any master. Isolation was a dangerous companion. Days spent in silence, surrounded only by enslaved servants. Every movement, every glance a reminder of control. In that stillness, a sickness of the soul began to grow. Some mistresses punished enslaved men not for disobedience, but for imagined slights, for existing, for reminding them of a power they could never possess outside those walls. Their cruelty wasn't born from strength, it came from desperation. A craving to feel powerful in a world that denied them freedom, so they took it from those who had none. It was an exchange of pain, downward, always downward. The enslaved men who worked near the house, who tended to their every order, lived in constant danger. Their lives balanced on the edge of obedience and fear. To speak too boldly was rebellion. To speak too little was insolence. And to be noticed at all by the wrong person could be fatal. They learned to disappear in plain sight, to shrink their presence, to carry themselves carefully through every moment. Because inside those grand houses, survival wasn't only about strength, it was about silence. Imagine a world where every breath must be measured, every glance calculated, every word rehearsed, because someone else owns your fate. And above it all, the myth of white purity remained untouched, worshipped, protected. The world called them innocent. But innocence is fragile when built on domination. It wasn't just the men in the fields who enforced slavery. It was the women in the parlors, the ones holding teacups, the ones reading psalms, the ones whose hands never touched a whip but whose words could end a life. They called it order. They called it civilization. But it was control, raw, personal, and cruel. And in that control, power began to rot from the inside. Because when power is absolute, even the gentlest faces can hide the filthiest truths. The question remains, what kind of horrors are born when the powerless gain power, not to free themselves, but to hurt those already broken? The truth, however, could not be erased forever. For every plantation that fell silent, there were whispers, fragments of memory passed down like secret warnings. Don't trust what history calls innocent, they seemed to say. Enslaved men carried stories they could never tell. Stories of humiliation, of commands they could not refuse. Their suffering lived in their bones, unspoken, because to speak was to die. The world had already decided that they were dangerous, and that belief alone was a death sentence. To reject a white woman's authority, even by accident, could mean torture. To appear defiant could lead to the tree, the rope, the mob. But to comply was another kind of death, one of spirit, dignity, and identity. They were trapped inside a system that punished them either way. No refuge, no right to truth, only silence. Imagine the weight of that, to wake each day and wear obedience like armor, knowing it could never really protect you. For these men, freedom was not just about escape. It was about surviving the daily, unseen brutality of power turned intimate. The records barely mention them, but you can feel their presence between the lines, in the tone of letters, in the guilt dripping from forgotten journals. They were ghosts even while alive, erased by the very hands that held power over them. And yet, the system justified itself. White society painted these men as beasts, savage, lustful, incapable of morality. Convenient lie, one that excused violence, one that made the innocent appear guilty, and the guilty untouchable. The myth of the pure Southern lady was the mask that covered it all. Behind that mask there was envy, there was rage, there was the quiet rot of a culture built on domination and denial. The irony was unbearable. The very society that claimed to guard virtue was drowning in corruption. The women who were said to embody grace were, in truth, both prisoners and wardens, trapped in the same poisonous system they enforced. When the Civil War ended, and the plantations began to crumble, so too did their silence, but only in whispers. A few voices emerged, abolitionists, reformers, writers, hinting at the abuses no one wanted to name. Some spoke of the unmentionable, others of hidden cruelties. The words were careful, censored, because to accuse a white woman of cruelty, especially toward a black man, was to defy the entire mythology of the South. The archives show traces, an overseer's note, a rumor in a freedman's testimony, a widow's confession written and never sent, tiny pieces of a larger, dirtier truth. The silence wasn't just social. The narrator's voice fades to a whisper. It was intentional. Historians for decades ignored it, choosing instead the comforting lies of plantation romance. The magnolias, the moonlight, the illusion of civility. But no perfume can hide the stench of buried pain. For every portrait of a smiling mistress, there were countless unseen tears of those who served beneath her gaze. Modern scholars finally began to listen, to read between the lines, to name what was once unspeakable. They uncovered how white women, denied political and social freedom, sometimes sought control in the only realm left to them, the enslaved bodies they commanded. It wasn't love. It wasn't desire. It was domination, the same sickness that defined the entire system of slavery. And yet, these women were never held accountable. History shielded them with silence, wrapped them in nostalgia, called them delicate victims instead of powerful perpetrators. For every marble statue of Southern grace, the voice says coldly, "There's a ghost that still cries in the fields." These ghosts are not imagined. They're real, carried in memory, in bloodlines, in the collective ache of a people whose stories were buried under white lies. Psychologists today call it intergenerational trauma. Historians call it complicity. But for those who lived it, there were no words, only the knowledge that justice never came. Power distorts morality, poisons empathy, creates monsters not by nature, but by permission. Slavery gave people permission to act without conscience, and in doing so, stripped them of their own humanity. When white women, bound by patriarchy yet armed with ownership, turned that power inward, they became reflections of the cruelty they themselves endured. Oppression doesn't always teach compassion. Sometimes it teaches imitation. What does it say? The voice asks softly. About a society when even its gentlest faces could commit unspeakable acts. The screen fades to black. Only the hum of wind through empty fields remains. The story of slavery is not only about the chains that bound the body, but the silences that bound the truth. These are not tales of vengeance. They are calls for remembrance, to name what was hidden, to acknowledge what was denied, because silence, too, is a kind of violence. And beneath every plantation rose, there was blood in the soil, blood that still calls out, not for revenge, but for recognition. History, for too long, has been written by those who needed to believe in their own innocence. But the truth, raw, disturbing, unpolished, cannot be erased. The voice lowers to a whisper, because history's dirtiest secrets don't disappear. They echo, waiting for someone brave enough to listen. The camera pans across an abandoned plantation. The windows are broken, the walls cracked, the portraits faded. In the silence, you can almost hear them, the footsteps, the breathing, the ghosts. This is not the story of power. The final words echo. It's the story of what power destroyed.